When you hear the name Astor, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's a word that glitters with an almost mythical luminescence, a name dipped in gold and steeped in tragedy. It conjures visions of the Gilded Age, of Titanic ballrooms and Fifth Avenue mansions, of women in diamonds and men who commanded empires, of fur and real estate. We see a legacy of almost unimaginable American wealth, of a dynasty so powerful it became a kind of untitled royalty in a nation that had rejected kings. It's a landscape of such staggering opulence, of such dynastic certainty, that we rarely stop to consider the extraordinary, almost bizarre human drama that churned just beneath its polished surface. We see an American institution, but what if I told you the most fascinating, consequential, and ultimately tragic chapter of the Astor story didn't happen in America at all? This is the story of the other Astors, a branch of the family that, in an unprecedented act of social rebellion, took its colossal American fortune and embarked on one of the most audacious and ambitious projects imaginable: to flee the New World and conquer the Old. Their goal was to transmute the raw, glittering ore of new money into the ancient, hallowed pedigree of the British aristocracy. Their influence would reshape the British social and political landscape, placing them at the very center of power, secrets, and scandal. We see the grand halls of Cliveden House, the hushed benches of Parliament, and the decadent weekends that would bring a government to its knees, all stamped with the Astor name. But what if I told you this wasn't a simple story of a successful reinvention, but a three-act tragedy of ambition, glory, and self-destruction? Today we are pulling back the heavy brocade curtain on one of the most dramatic dynastic gambles in modern history. This is the story of how a bitter family feud in New York launched a social invasion of London, how an American fortune bought a British title, and how a name that became synonymous with aristocratic power would ultimately become a byword for moral decay and public shame. This is the Astors in England, the American dynasty that bought a crown, and the scandal that brought it all down. To understand the world-altering force that the British Astor dynasty would become, you must first transport yourself to an America drunk on its own burgeoning power. Imagine the world into which the family's destiny was bifurcated, the ruthless, glittering, and rigidly stratified landscape of late 19th century New York. This was an America defined by the Gilded Age, an era of shocking excess where industrial titans with names like Vanderbilt and Carnegie amassed fortunes that dwarfed those of European monarchies. But this new raw power was deeply insecure. It draped itself in the silks and velvets of European tradition, building French chateaux on Fifth Avenue and inventing aristocratic rules for a society of men who had a generation earlier been shopkeepers and farmers. In this world, society was not a casual affair. It was a battlefield, a complex game of manners and bloodlines with ironclad rules. And its undisputed, unquestioned, and often cruel empress was a woman named Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Known to the world simply as the Mrs. Astor, she was the matriarch of the family's dominant American branch, and her word was law. Her approval could launch a family into the stratosphere. Her displeasure could render them invisible. Her legendary ballroom, it was said, could hold precisely 400 people. To be counted among the 400 was to have arrived. To be excluded was to be a social ghost. It was into this gilded cage that William Waldorf Astor was born. He was the architect of the British dynasty, the patriarch whose profound bitterness would launch 1,000 ships, or rather one family, across the Atlantic. He was not an adventurer. He was a refugee, fleeing a war he could not win. Born in 1848, He was the only son of the senior male line, the inheritor of the single largest portion of the original Astor fortune. By any measure, he was one of the richest men in the world. But in the cruel calculus of New York society, this was not enough. William Waldorf was a quiet, scholarly, and deeply sensitive man, a Renaissance soul trapped in an age of robber barons. He had tried to play the part expected of him, serving in the New York State legislature and even as the American minister to Italy. His political forays were a disaster. He was portrayed in the press as a stiff, awkward patrician, utterly lacking the common touch required for the boisterous theater of American democracy. But these experiences only confirmed his distaste for the glad-handing and grubby realities of American politics. His time in Rome, surrounded by the ancient glories of a fallen empire, was a revelation. There, as His Excellency, the American minister, he moved through a world of old European nobility, a world where lineage, intellect, and subtle manners were the currency of status, not the raw brute force of commerce. He found the endless competition and the rigid social codes of New York suffocating. His true tormentor, however, was his own aunt, the formidable Caroline. A quiet, simmering war existed between them, a struggle for the social supremacy of the Astor name itself. The core of the conflict was simple. Who had the right to be called Mrs. Astor? Caroline, the wife of his father's younger brother, claimed the title as her own by sheer force of will, her claim ruthlessly enforced by her social vizier, Ward McAllister. William, as the head of the senior branch, believed it rightfully belonged to his wife, Mary. It was a deeply personal public feud fought over invitations, seating arrangements, and whispered insults. A Gilded Age Cold War played out in the ballrooms of Manhattan. The final public humiliation came, as it so often did, at a grand ball. Imagine the scene. A swirl of gaslights illuminating a king's ransom in diamonds, the air thick with perfume and the rustle of Worth gowns. This was the arena where fortunes were made and reputations were broken. William's wife, Mary, as the wife of the clan's titular head, expected to be granted the supreme place of honor, to be received immediately as befitted her station. Instead, Caroline Astor, in a calculated power play, made her wait, leaving her standing while lesser guests were welcomed. It was a subtle but devastating public rebuke, a clear signal to all of New York's elite who the true queen was. For William, this was the final cut. It was a definitive statement that in New York, he and his line would forever be eclipsed by his aunt's formidable will. His reaction was not one of quiet retreat, but an act of magnificent architectural revenge. In a move that stunned society, he ordered his family's mansion on Fifth Avenue demolished. In its place, he began construction of the most opulent, towering hotel the city had ever seen, the Waldorf, and he built it right next door to his aunt's own home, a 13-story colossus of brick and stone designed to cast her house, both literally and figuratively, in perpetual shadow. It was designed with every conceivable modern luxury, full electricity, telephones in the rooms, private bathrooms, innovations that made the private mansions around it, including his aunt's, look instantly old-fashioned. You can almost imagine Caroline peering through her lace curtains, not just at a construction site, but at a daily grinding, deafening symbol of her nephew's contempt. By building a commercial hotel, a place of trade, he was also mocking the very aristocratic pretensions she held so dear. It was a spectacular, ruinously expensive middle finger to the world that had slighted him. This audacious act kicked off an architectural arms race. Not to be outdone, Caroline's own son, John Jacob Astor IV, would eventually tear down his mother's house and build an even grander hotel, the Astoria, right next door. William's revenge had started a war that would forever change the New York skyline. Having delivered this final thunderous rebuke, William Waldorf Astor did the unthinkable. He liquidated assets, packed up his family, and in 1891 sailed for England. He was not just moving, he was defecting. The shock in New York society was palpable, and Astor, abandoning America, it was a rejection of the entire Gilded Age ethos, an insult to the very idea that American wealth was the pinnacle of human achievement. He famously and bitterly declared, "America is not a fit place for a gentleman to live." He was a man possessed by a singular burning ambition to use his limitless American wealth to purchase something that was not for sale in New York, a history, a heritage, and the unimpeachable status of a British aristocrat. He wasn't just raising a family, he was forging a new identity from scratch, and the pressure on them to succeed to justify this monumental act of social exile was absolute. The stage was set not for a new life, but for a new dynasty, founded not on a love for England, but on a deep and abiding resentment of America. William's arrival in England was less an immigration and more a financial invasion. He wielded his fortune like a weapon and a key, determined to blast open the doors of the British establishment. He understood that he could not earn a pedigree, so he did the next best thing. He bought the buildings that housed it. His first and most significant purchase was Cliveden House, a spectacular Italianate palace in Buckinghamshire set on hundreds of acres overlooking the River Thames. Cliveden was not just a house, it was a theater of English history, a place that had been home to princes, dukes, and earls, its halls echoing with centuries of political intrigue and royal scandal. This was a place where royal mistresses had held court and governments had been formed and broken. By installing himself as its master, the quiet man from New York was physically writing his family into this aristocratic narrative, hoping its history would rub off on him. But he was not finished. He then acquired Hever Castle in Kent, a moated, crenellated fortress steeped in the high drama of the Tudors. This was the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, the bewitching and doomed second wife of King Henry VIII. If Cliveden was a purchase of the 19th century political power, Hever was a far more romantic and psychological acquisition. It was an attempt to buy into the very marrow of English history, into its legends of love, betrayal, and tragedy. The castle had fallen into disrepair, a beautiful ruin sinking into the Kentish countryside. Astor poured a staggering fortune, the equivalent of over $150 million today, into its meticulous restoration. This was no simple renovation, it was an act of historical fantasy on an almost fanatical scale. He employed over 1,000 men who worked for years, not just to repair the castle, but to create the perfect historical illusion. Entire Tudor-style buildings were constructed around the castle to form a village, some using authentic period facades he had purchased and transported from other historic sites. Inside, he installed every modern convenience, from central heating to electricity and ensuite bathrooms, but had them all ingeniously hidden behind secret panels and sliding bookcases so as not to break the spell. It was the ultimate historical theme park, built for an audience of one. The grounds became a canvas for his own imagination. He created a spectacular Italian garden, a grand promenade designed to showcase the priceless collection of Roman statues and sarcophagi he had acquired during his time in Italy. This created a fascinating and bizarre juxtaposition, a slice of ancient Rome nestled beside a Tudor fortress in the English countryside. It revealed that his goal was not pure restoration, but the creation of a personal utopia, a place where all the history and beauty he admired could coexist under his ownership. It was the ultimate power move, the American new money man acting as the lavish protector and curator of the very heritage of the class he so desperately wished to join. These acquisitions were not the hobbies of a rich man. They were strategic assets in a campaign for acceptance. He complemented these purchases with a fire hose of philanthropic and political donations. He bought major newspapers, including the influential Pall Mall Gazette, becoming a powerful Fleet Street press baron. This was a shrewdly modern tactic. Owning the paper gave him a direct line into the London clubs and halls of Westminster, a platform from which to burnish his own reputation and attack those who still viewed him as a vulgar American upstart. When the First World War erupted, his contributions became monumental. He gave sums to the war effort that were, even by the standards of the day, astonishing. More powerfully, he turned a large part of Cliveden itself into the Duchess of Connaught's Red Cross Hospital, a state-of-the-art facility for wounded Canadian soldiers. The image of the glittering ballroom and gilded salons being transformed into hospital wards, with nurses tending to the shattered bodies of men from across the empire, did more to solidify his position in his adopted country than any check ever could. His generosity, combined with his media influence and his significant donations to the ruling political parties, made him impossible for the establishment to ignore. In an era where peerages were often granted in a less than transparent exchange for political and financial support, Astor was a prime candidate. In 1917, his lifelong obsessive quest reached its triumphant conclusion. King George V raised him to the peerage. William Waldorf Astor, the bitter exile from New York, became the first Viscount Astor of Haver Castle. He had done it. He had alchemized American dollars into a British title. His family was no longer merely rich, they were noble. He died just 2 years later, a somewhat reclusive and melancholic figure to the end. He had won his war, but the question remained whether the victory had ever brought him peace. For a man driven so completely by resentment, the final achievement of his goal seems to have left a quiet void. He had built the foundation, a magnificent stage of castles and titles, but the true golden age of the British Astors and the seeds of their spectacular downfall would be sown by the next generation, who inherited the prize without the all-consuming obsession that had paid for it. The second generation of the British Astors was its zenith, the moment when the patriarch's audacious dream was realized with a glamour and influence that even he could scarcely have imagined. This triumph, however, was not the story of a lone man, but of a partnership, a political and social tandem that would become one of the most powerful and talked about in the world. It was a court presided over by a dutiful, unassuming king and a brilliant, fiercely ambitious, and utterly revolutionary American queen. The inheritor of the title was William's son, Waldorf Astor. Unlike his stern and socially insecure father, Waldorf was gentle, conscientious, and deeply principled. He had been educated at Eton and Oxford, and he was in manner and temperament thoroughly anglicized. His life, however, and the Astor legacy itself would be irrevocably defined by the woman he married, Nancy Langhorne. A Virginian by birth, one of 5 famously beautiful sisters, Nancy was a force of nature, beautiful, fiercely intelligent, bitingly witty, and possessed of a will of pure steel. She was a survivor. Her disastrous first marriage to an abusive alcoholic had left her scarred, but also forged her determination never again to be a victim. She was also an American, and more scandalously for the time, a divorcee. Their union on a transatlantic crossing was a meeting of opposites: his quiet, steady, inherited Englishness and her fiery, hard-won American resilience. It was not just a marriage. It was a merger of his immense inherited position and her ferocious, uncontainable ambition. Together they transformed Cliveden from a mere stately home into the glittering, undisputed epicenter of British social and political life. On any given weekend in the 1920s and 30s, the guest list at Cliveden was a roll call of the world's most powerful and influential figures. One might find Winston Churchill arguing politics over brandy, George Bernard Shaw debating philosophy on the lawns, or T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, quietly holding court. But to imagine Cliveden as a stuffy formal salon would be a mistake. Its magic lay in its unique fusion of American informality and British high society. Unlike the rigid, protocol-bound weekends at other great English houses, a weekend at Cliveden was a dynamic, unpredictable affair. It was a vibrant, chaotic, and often hilarious social theater orchestrated by its indefatigable hostess. Nancy would lead her guests on vigorous walks, organize fiercely competitive games of tennis and charades, and preside over dinner with a mixture of charm and interrogation. She was famously direct, often to the point of rudeness, believing it was her duty to provoke her powerful guests into revealing what they truly thought. She was a devout Christian Scientist and a teetotaler, which created a fascinating tension, as she would strictly enforce a no-alcohol policy for herself, while often serving the finest wines and spirits to guests like the notoriously bibulous Churchill. While Nancy orchestrated the social whirlwind, her husband Waldorf provided the calm, intellectual anchor. He would host deep, substantive political discussions in the library, his quiet gravitas perfectly complementing his wife's effervescent energy. Prime ministers, maharajas, authors, and artists flocked to the Astor's orbit. Waldorf and Nancy were not just hosts, they were conveners. Their drawing room a shadow parliament where the great issues of the day were discussed and debated with an intoxicating blend of high intellect and high society. But Nancy Astor was never content to be merely a society hostess, the power behind the throne. Her historic moment arrived in 1919, when her husband Waldorf inherited his father's viscountcy upon his death. He was legally obligated to relinquish his seat in the House of Commons and ascend to the House of Lords. In a move that was seen as radical, shocking, and to many preposterous, Nancy announced that she would run for her husband's vacant seat. The idea of a woman, let alone an American divorcee with a famously sharp tongue, sitting in the mother of all parliaments was almost unthinkable. Even Waldorf was initially hesitant, concerned that the brutal bear pit atmosphere of parliamentary politics was no place for his wife. But Nancy's determination was absolute. She was a natural campaigner wading into the working-class districts of Plymouth, unafraid of the hecklers who came to bait her. One man shouted that she was a member of the decadent upper class. She shot back that, unlike him, she didn't have to worry about her next meal, and could therefore dedicate all her time to his concerns. She won the crowd over. Her quick wit and fearless speeches won over the voters of Plymouth Sutton. On December 1st, 1919, Lady Nancy Astor walked into the Palace of Westminster and took her seat, becoming the first woman in British history to serve as a member of Parliament. The chamber was a sea of dark suits, a hostile men's club built by and for men, so much so that there wasn't even a ladies' restroom near the chamber. For the first 2 years, she was the only woman there, an isolated and often ostracized figure. Other members would pointedly turn their backs when she rose to speak, and one even tried to have the floor disinfected after her maiden speech. But she refused to be intimidated. For the next 25 years, she was one of the most famous and controversial figures in British politics. She was a passionate, if sometimes erratic, champion for social reform, focusing on the rights of women and children. Drawing on the pain of her first marriage, she successfully introduced a bill to raise the legal drinking age in Britain to 18, a law that remains in effect today. She was not a great orator in the classical sense. Instead, she perfected a style of interruption and heckling from the benches. These Astorisms, as they came to be known, were sharp, witty, and designed to puncture the pomposity of the all-male chamber. Her parliamentary duels with Winston Churchill became the stuff of legend. In their most famous apocryphal exchange, she is said to have exclaimed, "Winston, if I were your wife, I would put poison in your coffee." To which he shot back, "Nancy, if I were your husband, I would drink it." But their relationship was more complex than mere animosity. It was a long, tangled rivalry between two brilliant, egotistical, half-American aristocrats who were both, in their own ways, outsiders. Her wit was her armor and her weapon, and she used it to carve out a place in a world that was entirely aggressively male. Yet beneath the inspiring story of the pioneering feminist, there was a more complex and troubling reality. Nancy's political views were a cocktail of progressive social concern and deeply ingrained prejudice. Her devout Christian Science faith gave her an unshakable self-confidence, but it also made her dogmatic and intolerant of opposing views, particularly on medicine and public health. Most controversially, she harbored strong anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic sentiments. These views were tragically not uncommon among her class at the time, but which she expressed with a startling and often shocking frankness that would be political suicide today. Her anti-Catholicism was fierce, and her anti-Semitism was rooted in a paranoid suspicion of international conspiracies. She once rose in Parliament during a debate and reportedly shouted, "We should get rid of all the Jews," a comment so outrageous that even in the 1930s, it caused a shocked silence. These prejudices represented the profound and troubling contradiction at the heart of her character. A woman who could fight so passionately for some could hold such hateful views towards others. It would cast a long, dark shadow over her legacy. That shadow grew to its most ominous in the late 1930s, as the world slid inexorably towards another war. Cliveden, the symbol of glamour and influence, became associated in the public mind with something far more sinister, the Cliveden set. This term was a brilliant piece of political propaganda coined by a communist journalist, Claude Cockburn, to describe a circle of influential politicians, journalists, and aristocrats who frequented the Astor home. This group, which included powerful figures like Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, was accused of being the architects of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement towards Adolf Hitler. They were painted as a shadowy cabal of Nazi sympathizers, secretly manipulating British foreign policy from the comfort of Cliveden's drawing rooms, often in conversation with Hitler's ambassador to London, Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was a welcome guest. The truth of the Cliveden set remains a subject of intense historical debate. The Astors and their defenders always vehemently denied being pro-Nazi, arguing they were simply pro-peace. Waldorf in particular was haunted by the unimaginable slaughter of the First World War, where he had lost countless friends. He saw another European war as the ultimate catastrophe and believed, with a tragic naivete, that Hitler could be reasoned with. Their misjudgment of the true nature of the Nazi regime was profound and unforgivable. It was a catastrophic failure of vision, born from a combination of genuine pacifism, a deep-seated fear of communism, and the inability of their class to comprehend the revolutionary evil that Nazism represented. But it was likely born not from malice, but from a desperate, misguided hope to avoid another apocalypse. Nevertheless, the accusation stuck. The name Astor, which the first Viscount had worked so obsessively to associate with the highest echelons of the British nobility, was now being linked in headlines with capitulation to fascism. The Golden Age was irrevocably tarnished. The reign of the great power couple was drawing to its close, setting the stage for a third and final act, one that would see the family name dragged from the heights of political controversy into the depths of a scandal so sordid it would forever redefine their legacy. For every great dynasty, there is a moment when the cracks that have been forming for generations finally splinter, when the weight of the legacy becomes too much for the inheritors to bear. For the British Astors, that moment was not a slow decline, but a sudden, spectacular, and deeply humiliating implosion. The third generation, born into a world of unimaginable privilege, would see their family name transform from a symbol of power into a byword for sleaze and scandal. The stage for this final tragic act was, once again, the magnificent estate of Cliveden, but the drama it would host was not one of high politics, but of low morals. The third Viscount Astor, William Bill Astor, who inherited the title in 1952, was a man ill-equipped for the tempest that was about to break over his head. Unlike his politically savvy parents, he was a gentle, good-natured, and somewhat retiring man. Having grown up in the long shadow of his formidable and famously domineering mother, Nancy, Bill had none of her appetite for the public stage or political combat. He was a kind host and a devoted family man, married to the intelligent and elegant Bronwyn Pugh, a celebrated model who had been a muse for the couturier Pierre Balmain. Theirs was a glamorous, modern, aristocratic marriage. But Bill possessed none of the fierce ambition of his grandfather or the political fire of his mother. While Nancy had thrived in the spotlight, Bill seemed to shrink from it. His true passions were for the land itself, for his prize-winning horses, and the quiet, ordered life of a country estate manager. He was, by all accounts, a decent man who found himself the custodian of a legacy he seemed not to fully understand, a quiet figure standing on the precipice of a cultural earthquake. The early 1960s in Britain were a time of seismic social change. The staid, deferential post-war world was giving way to the swinging 60s, an explosion of youth culture, sexual liberation, and a gleeful contempt for the old establishment. Cliveden, under Bill Astor's stewardship, continued to be a place of lavish weekend parties. But the guest list was changing. The politicians and press barons now mingled with a new, edgier set of artists, models, and society hustlers. The key that unlocked the door between these two worlds was Stephen Ward, a charismatic and well-connected osteopath and artist. Ward was a social chameleon of breathtaking skill. His patients included the highest echelons of the establishment, from Lord Astor himself to Winston Churchill, but his true passion was discovering and sketching the beautiful, unknown young women who were flocking to London. He was the serpent in this aristocratic Eden, offering a taste of a new, classless, and dangerous world that the kind and perhaps terminally bored Lord Astor found dangerously alluring. It was into this volatile mix that the other key players of a history-altering scandal were introduced. There was John Profumo, the dashing and ambitious Secretary of State for War in Harold Macmillan's conservative government. And there were two young women, Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davies, beautiful, vivacious party girls who were protégés of Stephen Ward. They were not heiresses or debutantes. They were working-class girls who represented a new kind of power, a power based on youth, beauty, and a bold, unapologetic sexuality that was utterly unimpressed by titles or tradition. They were the faces of a new modern Britain, a world away from the stiff upper lips of the Cliveden of old. The fuse was lit on a sweltering weekend in July 1961. Bill Astor was hosting a party at Cliveden. The atmosphere was a heady cocktail of old and new, the croquet lawn and Pimm's mixed with jazz music, and the flirtatious energy of Ward's young friends. By the swimming pool, a chance encounter occurred that would bring down a government. John Profumo and his wife, the respected actress Valerie Hobson, were being shown around the grounds by Astor when they came upon the 19-year-old Christine Keeler, who was playfully swimming naked after misplacing her swimsuit. Profumo, a married man at the heart of the British government, was instantly captivated. An affair began. This was a dangerous indiscretion, but what catapulted it into a full-blown national security crisis was Keeler's other lover, a handsome Soviet naval attaché stationed in London named Yevgeny Ivanov. Ivanov was a known intelligence officer. The fact that the British Secretary of State for War was sharing a mistress with a Soviet spy, often meeting her on alternate nights, was a scenario ripped from the pages of a Cold War thriller. The potential for blackmail was terrifying. Bill Astor's role in this tangled web was both central and, in his mind, innocent. He was the host, the master of ceremonies for the drama. Stephen Ward, the orchestrator of these relationships, was his friend and was renting a cottage on the Cliveden estate for a nominal fee. This wasn't a one-off party. Cliveden had become the respectable aristocratic base of operations for Ward's increasingly sordid games, and, as would later be revealed to his profound public shame, Bill Astor himself had engaged in a brief, foolish fling with Christine Keeler. It wasn't a grand passion. By most accounts, it was a pathetic, unreciprocated infatuation. It was a moment of weakness, a middle-aged man flattered by the attention of a beautiful young woman. He was not a spy or a conspirator. He was a philandering, good-natured aristocrat who was dangerously out of his depth, a man who had allowed his historic family home to become the playground for a cast of characters that would destroy him. When whispers of the affair began to circulate, John Profumo made a catastrophic error. He stood before the House of Commons and baldly lied, denying any impropriety whatever with Christine Keeler. But the truth, as it so often does, came out. The press, sensing the biggest scandal in a generation and freed from its old habits of deference, was relentless. When the whole sordid story was finally exposed, the lies, the affairs, the spy, the fallout was immense. John Profumo resigned in utter disgrace. His political career vaporized. The scandal fatally wounded the Macmillan government, contributing to its defeat in the 1964 general election. During the trial of Stephen Ward, another of the party girls, Mandy Rice Davies, provided the scandal's most iconic quote. When told in court that Lord Astor denied her claims of an affair, she retorted with a cool shrug, "Well, he would, wouldn't he?" That simple line perfectly captured the new cynical mood. The age of automatic respect for the aristocracy was dead. But for the Astor family, the consequences were arguably even more devastating. The Profumo affair dragged their name through the mud and made it a global punchline. The name Cliveden, which William Waldorf had bought to signify nobility and power, was now irrevocably linked with poolside orgies, call girls, and Cold War espionage. Bill Astor, the gentle Viscount, was portrayed as a pathetic, debauched aristocrat, a fool who fiddled while his country's security burned. He was publicly shamed in the press and ostracized by the very establishment his family had spent half a century and a fortune to join. The humiliation broke him. He retreated from public life, a shattered and disgraced figure. His health, never robust, collapsed under the strain. He died of a heart attack in 1966, only a few years after the scandal broke, at the age of just 58. Many who knew him said he died of a broken heart, a casualty of a scandal that he had not created but had foolishly enabled. The family's response to this utter catastrophe was to retreat into a wall of silence. His own son, the fourth Viscount, would later speak of how the subject became a complete taboo, a painful void at the center of their family. In a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of their reputation, they sought to bury the memory of the third Viscount and the affair that had destroyed him. The dazzling dream of the British Astors had ended in a nightmare of shame, scandal, and profound personal tragedy. After the spectacular history-making heights of the first two generations and the catastrophic public implosion of the third, the story of the British Astors enters its final chapter, a long, quiet, and deliberate fade into the background. The ferocious ambition that had propelled a family across an ocean and into the House of Lords was finally extinguished. It wasn't a failure of funds or a lack of ability. It was a failure of nerve, a deep collective trauma that replaced the instinct for conquest with a desperate instinct for self-preservation. It was a conscious pulling up of the drawbridge, a desire for the one thing the Astors had never truly known: privacy. The name still carried the weight of history and wealth, but the era of the Astors as a central driving force in British public life was definitively over. The inheritor of this tarnished legacy was Bill Astor's son, William Waldorf Astor III, who became the fourth Viscount in 1966. He was a boy of 15 when his father died, having grown up in the immediate, deafening silence of a scandal that was never to be mentioned. His inheritance was not just a title and a fortune, but the heavy burden of a name that was now synonymous with disgrace. His challenge was not to build an empire, but to salvage one, to restore a measure of quiet dignity to a name that had become a punchline. The family, in the aftermath of the Profumo Affair, made a conscious decision to lower its public profile. The first and most symbolic act of this retreat was the severing of ties with the stage of both their greatest triumphs and their deepest shame. Cliveden, the magnificent palace that had been the heart of their empire, was given to the National Trust. Today it operates as a luxury hotel, its scandalous past now a marketable feature. Tourists can take selfies by the infamous swimming pool, a site of profound family shame now reduced to a historical curiosity, the ultimate ironic loss of control over their own narrative. The succeeding generations of Astors have lived lives of quiet privilege and modest public service. The fourth Viscount served for a time in the government of Margaret Thatcher, but in a junior ministerial role, a far cry from the cabinet-level influence his grandfather had wielded. They have been successful in business and devoted to philanthropy, but they have meticulously avoided the kind of high-profile, society-shaping roles that defined their ancestors. The torch was passed, but its flame was deliberately kept low, shielded from the winds of public attention that had so badly burned the generation before. Interestingly, the family DNA remains woven into the fabric of the British establishment, but in a much more subtle way. Samantha Cameron, the wife of former Prime Minister David Cameron, is an Astor descendant. The bloodline is still connected to 10 Downing Street, but through marriage and quiet influence, not the raw, dominating power the first Viscount had sought. In a way, they have finally achieved the seamless integration he dreamed of, but only after the family's public ambition was broken. The great audacious gamble was over. What then is the ultimate legacy of this extraordinary dynastic arc. It can be seen as a Greek tragedy in 3 acts. The story begins with the hubris of William Waldorf Astor, a man so wounded by a social snub that he exiled himself and used a colossal fortune to buy his way into the most exclusive club in the world. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, transforming his family from American millionaires into British nobles. His story is a testament to the sheer power of wealth and an iron will. Then came the apex, the golden age of Waldorf and Nancy, a time of unparalleled glamour and influence. This was the family at the zenith of its power. Nancy Astor's story in particular remains a landmark of feminist history. She smashed one of the highest glass ceilings, proving that a woman could hold her own in the brutal arena of national politics. Yet that inspiring legacy is forever complicated by her own troubling prejudices and the dark stain of the Cliveden set, the fatal misjudgments made at the height of their power, a reminder that even trailblazers can have profound flaws. And finally, there is the nemesis, the tragic, pathetic story of Bill Astor, the reluctant viscount who presided over the dynasty's ruin. His tale is a cautionary one, a story of how a good but weak man born into a world he wasn't equipped to navigate could be utterly destroyed by the changing tides of his time. The Profumo Affair was not just a political scandal, it was a cultural turning point, and the Astors found themselves on the wrong side of history, their aristocratic world exposed as decadent and rotten. The story of the British Astors forces us to confront enduring questions about class, ambition, and identity. Can a name, a title, and a history truly be bought? Or is there something intangible about belonging that no amount of money can purchase? What is the price of uprooting oneself, of trading one national identity for another? The Astors sought to escape their new money American origins, yet their story is in many ways quintessentially American. A tale of bold reinvention, spectacular success, and an equally spectacular fall from grace. It's the ultimate cautionary tale about the illusion of control. William Waldorf thought his money could control his legacy. Nancy thought her force of will could control the political world. Bill thought he could control the activities in his own home. They were all tragically, devastatingly wrong. Their journey is not just about one family. It is about the complex, often fraught relationship between America and Britain, between New World energy and Old World tradition. It's a story about the immense power of a name and the unbearable burden that name can become. As the descendants now live their lives largely out of the spotlight, they leave behind the ghosts of their past, the bitter exile who built an empire, the pioneering firebrand who conquered Parliament, and the sad, broken man who lost it all. Perhaps in their quiet, private lives they have found a measure of peace that their famous, powerful, and endlessly restless ancestors never could. Their journey is a uniquely transatlantic story, one of staggering achievement and profound melancholy, a story that is truly and finally complete. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Astor Dynasty's English chapter. It's a story that proves that even the greatest fortunes cannot buy immunity from human folly, and that the grandest of houses can be brought low by the secrets whispered in its corridors. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that reveal the drama behind the dynasties. We'll see you next time